socialists. So, yeah, why should we care? Kind of first question that comes up. And actually, by show of hands, who has ever been chatting to someone? What about socialism, guys? Let's have a society free from the oppression of the capitalists. Not with money, exploitation, all of this. And who has ever heard, by a show of hands, yeah, but what about the USSR? There we go. Okay, that's kind of what I expected. I was wondering if there'd be a few people who are just like, no, what is this USSR? So, yeah, it's pretty much one of the first things that comes up. I remember, I got into socialism pretty young, about, I think years 5 or 6, and even then, people were still being like, yeah, but what about the USSR, Thomas? I'm so glad that the criticism has really adapted since I was 10 years old. So it's an important thing to actually know how to come back and say, well, what actually is the USSR? What understands it? What things, when people criticise the aspects of the USSR, should we reject, should we oppose, should we defend, and what things should we accept? It's vital for Marx's understanding to really kind of get past those very early arguments put against the ideas of Marxism. And secondly, and why we're doing it in this week, is it's very important to actually understand the history of the Bolsheviks and their legacy, and the legacy of 1917. Ultimately, this question comes down to, is 1917 a successful revolution or a failed one? If it was a failed one, where did the Bolsheviks go wrong and what can we learn from it? If it was successful, how do we then, why did the USSR itself collapse? And I think, again, these are two really key points to really try and understand the history and socialist movements. The effects of the USSR throughout the 20th century were incredible. It was the second, the whole Cold War was about it, the amount of international revolutions. Effectively, every single communist party across the world was in some respects linked to the fate of the USSR. In fact, generally, if somebody calls itself a communist party, it was explicitly set up or endorsed by the Soviet Union. Whilst if they call them a socialist party, they're kind of linked to the Fourth International or possibly the Second International. Kind of like fun pack, different social groups. But beforehand, if we're going to talk about what is the USSR socialism, is it a capitalist system, or what is it? Kind of makes a good idea to actually have an understanding of these concepts. So, to do so, what is Marxist method? Why do we say something socialist? Why do we say something's capitalist? Again, some, let's say, more liberal or reformist type things. Well, let's say make an argument. Maybe Britain's not really capitalist. Maybe Sweden, Scandinavia isn't really capitalist. How do Marxists respond to this? And we would say, no, it firmly is a capitalist nation. And why is this? Because capitalism is a society based on the production of commodities, i.e. the production for exchange. Everything in capitalism is produced, or virtually everything, because it makes someone profit. These tables were produced, these doors were produced, the glass was produced, this university runs, arguably, well, tending to that way, because ultimately it brings back profit on investment. If things don't bring profit in capitalism, with the exception of, let's say, if the state does it, it will just happen for, it won't get produced. No one's going to produce something which makes enough cost. And it's worth noting, this is actually not something which has always historically been true. If you take a look at feudal society, or slave societies, or hunter-gatherer societies, things were often produced directly for use. If you're a feudal peasant, and let's say you're living in Britain, or and you've got let's say you want I don't know, like some bacon for dinner, or some beef, or you want to get some cloves. You're going to have to produce most of these things yourself. You're going to have to raise a cow that you can kill for meat. You're going to have to raise pigs in a pigsty. You're going to have to chop down trees. You're going to have to mow fields. You're going to have to knit and all these things to actually create your clothes. Now, unless there are any feudal peasants in the room, I don't want to make any assumptions. I imagine everyone else gets almost everything they want via exchange, i.e. they work, they sell their labour, to often the capitals for a wage, and then with this wage they go into the market and they go and buy commodities they need. And this is ultimately fundamentally what capitalism is, when exchange, distribution and political systems are dominated by generalised production for exchange. So again, you did have markets in feudal societies, markets in slave societies. They weren't in the generalised form now. And ultimately, it means that you have this splitting up into two great groups in capitalism. On the one hand, you have the capitalist class, the exploiters, the owners of the means of production, who gain their wealth through the expropriation of, through the unpaid wages of the labourer. On the other hand, you have the working class who have nothing to live on except by selling themselves for wage. And as probably you're aware, this creates some bit of conflict in societies. Oh, I missed that. Okay, so done that one. And this conflict ultimately emerges in a, Marxist argument. Marx went on to argue that the working class, by the very nature of capitalism, by its continued monopolization, by their continued exploitation, by the technological advances, and by the nature of capitalism's need to continue to expand, created its own gravediggers, created the working class, who would find themselves forced by the nature of capitalism to take over society, to take over the running of production, to run production themselves, democratically, as a society, consciously, rather than the free market, to run society themselves. And this is what Marx called socialism. Production is decided democratically for use. We produce chairs and tables not because they make someone a profit, but because as a society, we consciously decide we need chairs and tables, we need education, we need healthcare. We need also a lot more space stations, I think. We need a lot more space stations. Also possibly, maybe more Netflix. But, otherwise I'd have to chat to my girlfriend and have deep, meaning conversations with her. It's much easier on Netflix. It's a personal thing. So production is, it's this, I'm sure she watches this. Production is decided and consciously determined democratically for use. And so working people own this. In how could this happen? Well, one of the ways in which it's come about in the past, and we've seen kind of primitive ideas of socialism, the basics of what socialism can run, is kind of a Soviet system where you have workers' councils come together. Workers are democratically elected onto their councils, let's say either representing a trade, either representing a group of trades, either representing their communities or different parts different things they're a part of, and they all come together to organise. This factory should be doing this shop should be selling this state should be doing this, etc. And you see this take a more general. As this comes up, you see actually a truly democratic society. And Lenin had a lot to say on actually like how democracy would itself work in socialism. Many people mistake Lenin for being this brutal dictator who was like, do what I say or you get shot. This is entirely against any of his methods and any of his writings, I would argue. He argued that all officials should receive no higher than a workman's wage, rather than the immense amount our current politicians and elected officials may have. Free and democratic elections with the immediate right of recall. Very prominent if you're currently in the Labour Party. Maybe the right of recall is very important on that one. No standing army or police, but the armed body of men, and all the tasks of running society to be gradually done by everybody. I.e. not have this division that you have an executive and a legislature, that they are separate bodies. They have to tell bureaucrats to go and do their work. Instead, this work is done and made a decision by everybody through these structures. And ultimately, Lenin argues that in a socialist society, the state and many of these apparatus wither away. They increasingly become less and less needed as the productive forces of society increase. So you no longer really need a state. You no longer really need money. You no longer have oppression or sexism and racism and all of this. Many of these things begin to wither away under a social society. When they completely withered away, when you have a stateless, classless society, this is what Marx called communist society. So, that's a bit of background. The Russian Revolution. So what was the situation in Russia, or pre-revolutionary Russia? Now, for any of you who've even mildly studied this period, basically the answer is just, it was terrible. It was, close to hell on earth in some respects. It was ruled by an absolute monarchy, ruled by the Tsar. Interesting etymological. Tsar is actually the Russian translation of Caesar. That kind of gives you an idea of just, even by name alone, how powerful the Tsar was. Everything in Russia was technically owned and controlled by either side, committed huge atrocities. The working class in Russia was only 5% of population. 95% of population was in some form, around that, was in some form of another peasants, again, living off the earth, making the food they needed, making the clothes they needed, making the living they needed. In many respects, it was still primarily a feudal system, with a huge aristocracy, huge lords still earning that. In fact, feudalism had only officially been abolished, i.e. just serfdom, where peasants were enslaved to the land they owned. No different from slavery in many respects. Only about 35 years ago. That's probably terrible maths, actually. It's maybe about 50 years ago, 1867. There was a huge amount of poverty. There were peasants who hadn't even had the wealth to even have a bath. Not even like running water. I mean, just actually getting hot water so you can sit in it and clean yourself. This lacked. This was completely lacking. At the same time, so there was a very, very backward country in the sense that like economically, devastated, very, very poor. At the same time, however, and here we see what Trotsky described as the uneven and combined development of society. When capitalists had come and invested in Russia, they had invested with the newest and strongest and best technologies which they could. And so, when you actually went into the cities, but where that 5% of working class lived, in many respects, they were the most advanced working class, on the basis that they were in factories which had like about 500 workers in the factory, 1,000 workers in the factory, 2,000 workers in the factory. Workers were forced in together in huge, huge numbers. And for this reason, they were also a very revolutionary working class. The British working class had gone through, and still has especially, gone through a very long, drawn-out history, having suffered many defeats, also gaining many reforms, and has a lot of illusions and stuff like this in it. The Russian working class weren't like this. You effectively just needed to say the word strike, and the entire factory would come out. And this is continuous thing. Throughout the Russian class, they were very, very militant because of the absolute poverty of the situation. In fact, so many of them were forced together. And also you see this in the 1905 revolution really come to a head, of course, 1917. So let's just for all imagine, we're in Russia, and for some reason I'm speaking English, and there's a debate going on in Russia in Marxist and left-wing circles. So where is Russia going? Or where is Russian Empire heading? Can we achieve capitalism? Can we achieve socialism? How can we reform the system or change the system? And ultimately, almost all writers at this time agreed that the key task for Russia wasn't, let's say, in Britain, where it was an immediate socialist revolution, where capitalism had, was effectively just destroy the capitalist class and, achieve workers' control. Instead, you actually had to tackle this enormous feudal system. Again, only 5% of the population were workers. And so this included, in many respects, what Marxists described as bourgeois democratic demands, were the order of the day, i.e. the overthrow of the Tsar, the establishment of a bourgeois republic, the end of the aristocracy, the development of the countryside into more and more proletarians, etc., etc. These type of things, in many respects, more similar to the French Revolution and the demands placed there, or the English Revolution, the English Civil War, and the demands placed there. Now, this led to a very strong debate between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, and also Trotsky, who kind of took his own position, which is quite similar to what Trotsky does quite a lot of the time, of how to respond to this. So on the one hand, it's almost basic Marxist knowledge, isn't it? That society first is a peasant social, is a primitive communist society, a slave society, feudal society, a capitalist society, a socialist society. So the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, argued that Russia is only a feudal society. We should instead support the ruling class to actually go and change and actually implement capitalism fully. We should have a revolution like the French Revolution, right? Like this bourgeois democratic revolution where the capitalist class take power. And then maybe in a long, long time we can strive for socialism. And this was the Menshevik position. Lenin and the Bolsheviks comes along and says, Martov, leader of the Mensheviks, you're talking rubbish here. How? How, I'll tell you. He didn't talk like that at all. But, how, I tell you, is the Russian bourgeoisie, who is linked to the capitalist, who's linked to the landlord and aristocracy by 1,000 threads, going to overthrow the feudal system. They are part of a feudal system. They are tied. Most of them are selves feudal landlords. This is an upcoming merchant class who has nothing to lose but can gain massive profits. So they overthrow the aristocracy. Instead, they are part of the aristocracy. They are deeply connected, personally, economically, socially. Instead, the only people who can actually develop capitalist society in Russia are the workers and peasants. They must take power and complete the bourgeois demands, the bourgeois democratic demands. And this was summarized in the slogan, dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. I.e. dictatorship being used in a more nuanced way than it is now, just effectively, you'd say capitalism is the dictatorship of capital, the bourgeois class, dictatorship of proletariat and peasantry is dictatorship of the workers and peasants, i.e. workers and peasants decide what's going on in society rather than the whims of capitalists. And many people agreed, and this was a bit prominent theory all the way up until April 1917. But all the way back in 1905, Trotsky had said, well, Lenin, I agree with you very much. You're a great guy. But really, the working class, they're going to install what now? They're going to install capitalism? The very thing which oppresses them day by day, which they know to be horror without end, and they're going to install this? Even if they're lovely, for reform and stuff like that. This isn't what's going to happen. No, I agree. And also, actually, I missed a key point. Lenin then also argued that this would then act to the dictatorship of proletariat and peasantry would then act as a spark for socialist revolution throughout Europe, which would then come back in and hit create a socialist revolution and the means to develop socialism in Russia. That's one point. And yeah, so Trotsky's like, they're not going to achieve capitalism. They instead will strive for socialism. Now, yes, we can't achieve socialism on this economic basis if Russia is isolated, but instead, they will still try that. That is, what the working class will meet. They will not accept capitalist rule. And instead, this will mean events will move very quickly. Now, actually, Lenin in April 1917, actually before that, technically February 1917, but made the Bolshevik exchange in April 1917, seeing the effects of the Russian Revolution, did change his mind over this coming period, and there was a big debate, the April thesis, Bolshevik conference, etc. They effectively go out and debate what is basically Trotsky's platform. There could be a bit of defense about this, but I'm kind of simplifying. That actually they should then strive for socialist revolution on the basis for it to act as the harbinger for socialism across Europe, and then achieving socialism in USSR, or in Russia at that point. So yeah, so the question is, could Russia achieve socialism? And ultimately, again, the thing was, as I kind of explained before, socialism is a society which comes after capitalism, which requires the lack of generalized want, which allows working people to have the time to actually take part in the active running of society. This is what socialism is: working people actively running society. It needs a certain level of economic basis, and when the economic basis is for most people, pretty close to starvation and subsistence. This is not a suitable base. And then, so why did Russia have a socialist revolution if it wasn't the strongest capitalist economy able to take that? It was precisely because it was the weakest capitalist economy. There was a capitalist economy completely buckled by the contradiction of capitalism, by the First World War, by its still feudal remnants. That actually socialist revolution, the workers were able to take control. But again, Lenin kind of sums up this view in 1905 with the Russian proletariat. So after achieving bourgeois democratic demands, after overthrowing aristocracy and society, etc., the Russian proletariat may win a second victory. The cause is then not lost. The second victory will be a socialist revolution in Europe, where European workers will show it as how it is done. And then, on this basis, Lenin and Trotsky, the Bolsheviks, they could then achieve socialism with the spread of international revolution. It was built in this way. And then, there's a good question here. So, okay, well, let's say if Lenin and Trotsky weren't invaded, didn't think socialism would succeed without, without having developed conditions, why did they still push for it? And they pushed for it because ultimately, this was the case, is that the working class were going to continue to strive for a socialist society. But unless they were successful, the only other result wasn't like a liberal wonderland, or like, a Britain or a Sweden or a Norway. It would have been a form of Russian fascism, fairly accurate to say, i.e. a Bonapartist state, the state rising up, balancing between the working class, balancing between the capitalist class, and using the capitalist and using the kind of enraged peasant layer, petty bourgeois, small trader layer to completely smash the workers. Any of the crimes committed under the USSR would either been equal to or completely surpassed by this form. Now again, it's difficult to say this, but this is at least, and I feel it's a quite easy argument to make, that at least a genuine threat that if socialism is not achieved, there will certainly be heavy reaction, and the reaction could be of a very, very, very strong layer. To give you an idea of what you see, you kind of get this sense in the Kornilov affair in August 1917, where he effectively comes in to try and introduce the death penalty for pretty much anyone. This was, remind you, after apparently the liberal revolution of February 1917, and actually Kerensky is himself moving in very similar direction there. So this is kind of why they're doing it. It isn't like they're not choosing between risking socialism but failing. They're either risking socialism or complete catastrophe and complete reaction for the working class. Also, actually, some of history under the Tsar also kind of shows this. So anyway, those were kind of the debates going on. That kind of gives you a bit of perspective of actually like where kind of the leaders of the Russian Revolution and where many of the socialists and Marxists active in the Russian Revolution kind of were going. But anyway, Russian Revolution then does happen. Tsar is kicked out in February 1917. The Bolsheviks then change their position to socialist revolution in April 1917. They continue to build up their forces. They win over the argument. They win the Moscow Soviet, the Petrograd Soviet. They win Soviets all across the USSR. And effectively, this all comes to culmination with the Social Revolutionaries having an outright majority in the All-Russian Congress and Soviets in October, which nicely coincides with them also taking power. October on the Julian calendar, for those who are quite worried about dates, or very much like calendars. So this happens. And then it doesn't then go so well. Again, the idea of a revolution spreading is quickly beaten down. The German people, German proletariat, rise up in 1918 under Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht. Bavaria gets completely taken over by Soviet control, i.e. worker council control. However, due to the inability, due to many ultra-left decisions taken at this time, they are beaten down and they are hit by vicious reaction on the part of the Freikorps, effectively what would come to basically, like Hitler by 1918, to kind of simplify. It's quite a bit of simplification. Similarly, you see uprisings in China, in Poland, in even Britain. In the 1926 general strike, millions of workers go on strike. Even in 1918, you even see the whole reason, actually, the British suffrage was achieved, suffrage for the working class and for women, was on the fear that the Russian Revolution put into the bourgeois establishment of a working class uprising in Britain. And there was this revolutionary wave. Well, the revolutionary wave then is defeated. Further than that, immediately, or actually, maybe not immediately, about early 1918, everyone else like, those Russian people, they're trying to do this socialism thing there. They're like, all these rich people, they gather in a room, should we let this happen? and decided to send 21 foreign imperialist armies to invade Russia. 21 countries, like, many of whom were actually fighting each other only a couple months earlier because of the of World War One. But you know, put differences aside, guys, capitalism's in trouble here. And they go and attack the Bolsheviks. The White Army rises up. Sections of reactionaries, the old ruling class, etc., backed by mercenaries and stuff like this. They rise up and they commit atrocities all over the USSR, trying to defeat the Bolsheviks. There's immense starvation in the country. The country is in complete ruin. You read statistics around this time, it's incredibly depressing. You see populations fall by 60, 70, 80% in some places. You see the best and most revolutionary workers, those most determined to achieve socialism, dying and getting killed in the Civil War. And the Civil War ultimately comes to an end. And the Bolsheviks do manage to succeed, which is like pretty incredible, to be honest. And then they find themselves, kind of isolated. Many of the revolutionaries have died down, and they're also in a period of complete economic devastation. Coming up from this, however, the USSR is able to strengthen itself. It falls under the leadership of Stalin when Lenin dies in 1924, and with the ousting of the left opposition in 1927. Yes, 1927. And actually achieves many successes. I think it is worth actually looking at the successes of the Russian Revolution and the USSR as a whole in this bit, because it is worth reading. They were so what did they have? Their economic victories for the Russian for the USSR were massive. They removed private property and nationalised the economy. In 20 years, in 1917 to 1940, or 30 years, 1917 to 1947, they became the world's biggest superpower, or second biggest superpower, going from a situation of complete poverty. It'd be the equivalent of, if we say, well, it's 2017 now, if we say in 2047, Pakistan will be the second most powerful nation and will control pretty much half the globe. It will be that influential and approaching the first. That's kind of the immense leap it makes. Between 1917 and 1967, the economy increased 9-fold. This is huge. They had the biggest growth rates completely on record, even when you accept they were coming from a low base. They've been, and this is with World War II, where Hitler sends the entire 90% of the German army to go and crush the Soviet Union. 90% of deaths that happened in World War on the East and West fronts happened on the Eastern fronts. Insane amount of damage. Millions and millions of Soviet citizens lost their lives, and they're still able to continue this economic increase. Whilst the British are just about kind of able to rebuild Coventry. They don't succeed in that, unfortunately, as I can tell by the state of my house. 570% growth between 1945 and 64, compared with 55% for the USA. And they do this with all super low, no unemployment. It was actually against the law to be unemployed, which we'll come back to. Is on the one hand progressive, on the one hand regressive. Not actually, wouldn't be possible under capitalism. They have super low inflation, minus a period in the 1930s, which a bit complicated, but basically they just decided to print loads of money because why not? And then achieve this with a balanced budget. Not something any of the capitalist economies seem doing. They also had a quarter of the world's scientists by 1970s, more than US, Britain, Japan, and Germany combined. And because of this, achieved great advances in space race. And this is what ultimately they had a planned production. They were using 5-year plans, and they were developing the economy on this basis. It wasn't done by the irrationality of the market. It wasn't done for private investors. It was instead done, I'll come back to this, but on the decision of effectively a higher strata of bureaucrats. But that has its problems. I will get into that. But not on the basis of the market. And we kind of see, some of the successes. Social victories. Homosexuality was decriminalised in 1918 with openly gay Soviet ministers. This was in 1918. The emancipation for women, full legal equality for women, And this wasn't just like altering minor things because apparently the Tsar was really progressive or anything. You know, like women, from what I understand, in many places weren't even allowed to go out without, you know, having assistance. Not assistance, without being chaperoned by, you know, a man to look after them. Because, you know, this was incredibly sexist society. They achieved full legal equality, get rid of all of that. In fact, Trotsky actually takes his wife's maiden name as his surname. Yeah, and that was considered a completely normal thing to do. They attempted to socialise household labour. This includes, you know, cooking, cleaning, childcare, to effectively, you know, take the strain of reproductive labour for women. As we'll hopefully get into next week. I'm not sure. There's something going on with that discussion. If not next week, next term, on kind of the nature of sexism on the capitals. Abortion and divorce are legalised and made very easy for women. Maternity leave and paid childcare. They recognise historically oppressed nationalities. Other victories include free education, free healthcare, explosions in art and culture with Einstein's cinema. Aaron, how do you pronounce that? Shostakovich. Thank you very much, Michael and Aaron, for the pronunciation there. Yeah, massive ballet, Olympic successes, the defeat of Hitler, and all whilst going through World War I, World War II, and a brutal civil war. However, I'm not going to go and sing the USSR praise, and it is important that we take into account that whilst the USSR was able to make major achievements, it did so at a huge cost and with huge inefficiencies. So A, you know, despite socialism being democratic control of the workers, this isn't particularly what you saw in the USSR. There were a huge amount of purges, executions, gulags. The NKVD, actually the secret police, had quotas to arrest a number of people. So they would be given a list saying you've got to arrest 5,000 Trotskyists today, or 2,000, you know, bourgeois, 2,000 members of the bourgeoisie, or something like that. Actually gave a really, whilst I was reading up this, I heard quite a morbid, but relatively amusing story about one woman who was locked in a gulag and she was arrested as a Trotskyist, and they said, "You're going to admit you're a Trotskyist?" And they were like, she was like, "Okay, I can't really do much if the NKVD come to your door in a Spanish Inquisition type way." She gets there, she gets to the thing, she's about to admit, they say, "No, you're a bourgeois now." It turned out the Trotskyist quota was full. Which, I mean, it shows you some of the madness that went on. 100,000 people were shot or arrested after the execution of Zinev and Kamenev. 2,000 delegates of the Congress, Bolshevik Congress of 1970, or the Communist Party Congress of 1934 were purged. Leading generals were, you know, like attacked and removed because they felt they had too much of relation to, let's say, Trotsky. These weren't leading white, you know, what were they called? These weren't leading Tsarist generals. These were generals who had fought in the Civil War, succeeded that, and then got over there, right up into the World War II. 90% of all generals were imprisoned or shot. 80% of colonel and 30,000 lower officers. Now, whilst, you know, I am in some respects, you know, like all for, you know, pacifism when possible, in the run-up to the Second World War in 1938, when Hitler is militarizing on an anti-communist, you know, program, getting rid of 90% of your all generals may not be the best thing in any situation. Suppression of books, press, literature, and the Bolshevik Party was converted into a part of the state apparatus, with millions killed or imprisoned. It wasn't kept as a separate party, but you know, like actually there was only, you know, it's made into a one-party state. The economy, we saw forced collectivization. Now again, so collectivization is basically taking farmland into common, so, you know, rather than having one peasant working it on their own, you have 10 peasants working on land 10 times the size, which, you know, in principle would fall. But it was the way it was done. From 1917 to 1929, less than 1% of land was collectivized, i.e. no land was collectivized. So, you know, peasants were just kind of going on with their life, like the oversimplification. Stalin then says, okay, we're now going to collectivize the farmland. This means that 65% of farmland is collectivized in 3 years. this wasn't, winning the argument over with peasants. This wasn't making the case. This wasn't allowing consent. This was storming over and saying that you collectivise your farm, put your farm in the collective holding. The problem with this is that many peasants, and because many it's incorrect, just saw it as a way, as a state grabbing the food of them and grabbing their belongings. So many of them would actually kill their cows, kill their sheep, before the state arrived, so they could have it rather than giving it collectively. Mainly because, again, the political argument wasn't won. This resulted in a huge famine with up to 3 million over 10, depending on the estimates. I don't know too much about the estimate figures. Maybe someone might. I'm not sure. But from what I've seen, that's around their range. 3 million to 10 million people dying in the famines. You saw great changes in wage from Lenin saying, any elected official should earn the average workman's wage. We saw wage differentials as up to 100 times the average worker. And the result this bureaucratic clique had over the economy meant that actually a huge amount of waste of the economic output was wasted, ranging from a third to a half. To give you a very, very good example that I heard one communist telling me was, so there was this nails factory, and it was producing nails. And the way in which the Soviet economy worked is that you'd be given a quota for how many nails produced, how many chairs produced, how much food produced, how many Trotskyists to kill, and yeah. So and they come up one day and they say, you're going to produce a huge ton of nails, and they were like, it was like 2, 3, 5 times more than they were producing. Like, well, this is just impossible. We're not going to do it. They say, you're going to do it because socialism needs you to. And they're like, okay, so this factory, they sit down and factory committee around, and like, okay, how are we going to do this, guys? And they're thinking, it's just not possible. You can't produce that amount of nails in this factory. You just don't have it. One guy's in the meeting, turns around and says, what if the nails were bigger? And so, no, bigger, to produce bit as it was measured in tons.
Oh, right.
So it was a tonnage of nails.
They did it twice. The first time it was a number of nails.
Yeah.
The second time it was weight.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I thought it was the other way around. But yeah. So basically, you get the number of tons of nails comes along, and they say, okay, so they produce these nails 30 foot high, and it meets the quota. Not particularly useful to have 30 foot high nails, but it does meet the quota in weight. So next year, the bureaucrat comes along again. He's like, okay, I see what you did there last time. This time, I want you to produce X number of wet nails. They're like, okay, again, we just can't do it. No, you're going to produce it. And so they sit down and like, okay, well, what if we just rejig the factory and just make really, really tiny nails? And so they produce, X number of nails, which were, like a millimetre thick or something like that, completely unusable. But again, fulfilled the quota. It kind of gives you an idea. I think this is a particularly great example in many ways. But it kind of gives you an idea of how the economic output was wasted by this. And furthermore, again, there were a big social regresses. So despite abortion and divorce being initially made legalised, they were then became made very difficult. Homosexuality was then recriminalised later on, effectively on the basis it was a form of paedophilia. And all the creativity in the arts was ended under the need to put social realism on, so, the worker with his tractor, that type of thing. So this leads us to a question then. So, okay, that's quite a mixed bag of of results. On the one hand, we have incredibly impressive results. On the one hand, incredibly oppressive results. So it leads to the question, like, what was the USSR? What went wrong, and how did ultimately Stalin and a lot of the bureaucracy end up creating, such huge tragedies? So there's a couple of perspectives that you come across. And this may be slightly unfair, but why not? The liberal perspective is, it was just all because Stalin was really evil. Like, he was super evil, guys. Now, there is some historical evidence for that argument, but it's not a particularly good one. You can't just simply say, oh, because, you know, it was this one individual in history managed to change everything around him. Now, the individual can have a great effect in history, but only if the right social conditions, and this is what, you know, historical materialism, very insightful, only in the right historical conditions are there to allow him to take place. Then the leader can be very effective, very decisive, but he doesn't create the situation out of nowhere. You can't simply say that, you know, if Stalin suddenly came in, was elected into, government, or, you know, appointed after Theresa May eventually collapses, that suddenly we will end up exactly like the USSR. Instead, there are complex social forces going on. And I really want to stress this, actually, and some people take kind of a different view, but just coming down that I personally do not think that it particularly matters if Stalin was there or Stalin wasn't there. In fact, I would say that actually his personal attributes had very little effect on the nature of the USSR, and I think that's what I really want to get on. And I think that's really interesting arguments, you know, to what extent was Stalin a revolutionary, to what extent was he effective in building the party, to what extent, you know, did he do horrible crimes, etc. and stuff like that, was in favour of them. The ultimate thing there, if it wasn't Stalin, it'd be someone else. If Stalin was a lovely person, he would still end up doing this. If it was Trotsky, he would still end up developing in a very similar manner. And that is a real key thing looking up here. So then, you then get a few other ideas come along, so kind of, it's really, really bad characterization. But, you know, like the anarchisty, liberal left perspective, that what happened in the USSR was inherent in Lenin's ideas and tactics. But ultimately, generally this doesn't actually take into account any of what Lenin's ideas or tactics were, as they were incredibly democratic. Again, the state of revolution, the passing at how the Bolshevik party functioned, again and again, really showed the democratic nature of Lenin. It wasn't like he was playing a two-sided game and he was writing this all down, but secretly thought differently. Lenin truly believed that socialism would be the real, true human emancipation of society. This is what he was fighting for. He wasn't fighting for his own power, his own power complexes or anything like that. But time and time again, he wanted working people to have power, and continually, whilst in power and whilst in the USSR until 1924, tried his best to get working people involved in the productive processes and running society, as you know, kind of linking back earlier. Now, yeah, but then people come along, yeah, but didn't he do all those things like getting rid of the Constituent Assembly, or, you know, like banning parties, or, like doing terrible stuff in the Civil War? And to which I say, yes, he did. As someone who's full support of Lenin, he did. But let's actually take note of the context in which this was acquiring. It was a civil war, a horrific civil war, a civil war where cannibalism was a common sight to see, a civil war where they were funded by 21 foreign imperialist armies. A civil war, you know, he only banned parties. In many respects, Lenin was quite slow, actually coming to any measures we consider totalitarian. When they first had the October Revolution, the Red Army literally went around, it would go up to like right-wingers and say, okay guys, you despise the Bolsheviks in every way and very much in favour of capitalist class, we're going to let you go. Just all you'll do, just give us your weapons and say, I'm now a good socialist and we'll like not organise counter-revolution. And so, you know, you got all these cadets, you got all these right-wing people, literally just sit there and go, yeah, okay, yeah, definitely, no counter-revolution for me. Literally then walked free, went down to southern Russia and organised massive armies to come and attack the Bolsheviks. And that was type of, you know, liberal attitude. Again, like, I mean, in many respects, very supportive, courageous, and I think good argument if whether Lenin should fund this or not, whether the Red Army should have been so lenient. I'm kind of in favour they did, as you know, like it was really down to the failing of the international revolution spread. This was type of thing. In fact, I would go as far as to say that, what is it? Actually, even with multi-part, so yeah, they ended up banning all of the parties apart from the Bolsheviks. But again, let's look in the context of what this was. It was after the Mensheviks, the names, the Right SRs, the cadets, all in open civil war against the government. They had gone over and joined the whites. In fact, they then only banned the left SRs after assassinating 3 generals and attempting to assassinate Lenin. That was only when this party was banned. Now, like, I mean, it's again like it's not that these tactics particularly great, but it's like this was kind of a result of a situation, and it has nothing to do with actually Lenin's inherent ideas and tactics. In fact, it'll be quite difficult to see who would actually what difference you would actually make in these conditions yourself. And ultimately, the key thing to remember is that, well, if it was the Bolshevik Party and Bolshevik organization and the ideas of Lenin which really led to Stalin, what I would call Stalinism, well then, why was it that Stalin attacked the Bolshevik Party the first? Why was it that the Bolshevik delegates were, first to be arrested, were first to be shot? Why was it there was no single, no, that's wrong. By 1941, there were only two members, three members of the Bolshevik Party who I think had died, either alive or had died naturally. That was Stalin, Lenin, who had died of a stroke, and Alexander Kollontai, who had actually quite a weird life and had actually basically become an ambassador to Sweden, and so basically just kind of missed the entire development of the USSR and just hung out in Sweden after the revolution for the rest of her life. He's been with me. So I wouldn't say that. Then there's a perspective, okay, maybe it was state capitalism. Maybe what Lenin was able to remove capitalism from Russia, but instead converted the state into capitalist. And this has a bit of appeal on it. The state's bad, capitalism's bad, combine them together, state capitalism, that's going to be pretty bad. And ultimately I think this is the thing, is that I also again reject this perspective on the basis of actually, and kind of thinking back to the initial bit, what capitalism is. It's production for exchange. That's an entire example for Engels. Shows, the USSR wasn't functioning on production for exchange explicitly. It was functioning on the decisions of bureaucrats on these quotas to try and improve the economy that way. It wasn't functioning by the laws of the market, by the need to constantly increase profit by any of this. And instead lacked commodity production. And so whilst many workers did experience the USSR to a similar way in even capitalism or even fascism, ultimately, to say the USSR was state capitalist kind of rejects, it basically implies that we could use our analysis of capitalism onto the analysis of the USSR, which would lead to mistakes. We can't simply say capital explains what happens in the USSR. It doesn't. It's a completely different social system. Same way capital gives no understanding, really, of how a feudal system works. They're their own thing going on. So, the big reveal, after 45 minutes of listening to me talk, what was the USSR? So what I put forward is that, I did forward, what Trotsky put forward in The Revolution Betrayed, fantastic work, is that ultimately what you ended up with was kind of this halfway house between capitalism and socialism, of a workers' degenerated state. So what does that mean? That is hardly an explanatory title. But ultimately, yes, the USSR had actually achieved, in many respects, a socialist mode of production. It eliminated private property. The workers now, production was planned, it was organised, it was consciously decided. Unlike in capitalism, many of the major economic moves had actually been made and have been accomplished under the revolution. However, the bureaucracy had risen up due to this, due to the social isolation, due to the immense economic backwardness, and whilst not being a separate class, it had grown above the workers and grown to have this control. And to give an example of how this happens, again, there's this really good analogy that Trotsky uses, is that if you have a bakery, and it has loads of food, there's no real problem. People come and go as they wish. The bakery's in complete abundance, and you just take and want as much as you want. There's it's all good. Just have make cakes you want. If, however, there's just enough, you're going to get a bit of a queue. If there's not enough, you're going to get a very long queue, and you're going to need a policeman to guard this queue. And ultimately, is this a kind of lazy economic basis, this scarcity, this requirement to use force, to use a state apparatus, to use a bureaucratic apparatus to control society, which kind of really comes down to the strength of the USSR. And to give a really good example, okay, probably not time for really good examples, but Lenin, when workers' control was genuinely tried, many of the workers were actually forced to sell the factories they're working in back to the capitalists to just get enough income for bread. So basically this gave two perspectives. Either A, the bureaucracy would have to be overthrown by the working class in a type of second socialist revolution. But rather than it being, revolution in the normal sense, it's more of, in respect, just democratizing society, removing the bureaucracy, implementing many, many reforms, ultimately having the structure of the USSR, but ran by working people, democratic control. This is ultimately, Trotsky argued, it was either going to happen like this, or the bureaucracy itself would find itself increasingly fed up with social production and need to resort to capitalist production. This is actually what we did see happen. Many of the bureaucrats found themselves that since the socialist system wasn't working, they weren't getting enough wealth from it, especially when their own bureaucratic competitors really started to ruin the economy in around the late 80s. They actually just abandoned the whole premise of ever trying to achieve socialism and took back capitalist system, made themselves into capitalists, completely stole the wealth from Russian working people, and you saw the biggest collapse in living standards, I believe, on history. Marxist perspective. So yeah, this came true, blah, 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 blah. Interesting to note, this perspective was, again, put forward by Trotsky in 1936, so it's very, stunning, actually, how that comes forward. There we go. So what can we learn? So the failure of the Russian Revolution was not a product of individuals or tactics, but instead a product of the social and political isolation they had. They attempted to achieve socialism, but ultimately could not achieve it under those economic conditions without spreading. The reason the Russian Revolution failed to spread was the lack of an international organisation. In many respects, I could go on for another 40 minutes on the failures of the Second International, but I feel everyone will leave. But this ultimately comes back to it that there wasn't an international socialist organisation to ensure that these revolutions succeed. Not to, say on high from above that, yes, we need socialism, but in a revolutionary situation like the Bolsheviks found themselves in throughout 1917, to be able to win over the arguments of working class of what actually are the specific next steps. In a revolutionary situation, all avenues seem possible, but not all avenues will lead to success. And this is why it is the job of Marxists, of those interesting ideas, socialism, of those wanting to create a better society, is their job to actually get together and try and work these things out in advance, work out these political questions, raise people's consciousness about these ideas, so when a revolutionary situation is thrusted upon us by capitalism, we are actually able to respond, able to help as members of the working class actually succeed in overthrowing the revolutionary situation. This isn't what happened in the revolution which spread there, and all of these places have really interesting histories on the failure of that leadership. But ultimately, what can we learn from today? Well, today the question, as always, is incredibly pressing. We need to start preparing that revolutionary situation now. Revolutionary events are coming. The newspapers are full of them. Like every day, this government looks closer to toppling. Probably not toppling to a socialist revolution, but it's just the instability of capitalism on a global scale. This is where events are heading, but we must prepare in advance for those revolutionary events. And ultimately, this is why every talk, it's kind of like a thing now, join the International Marxist Tendency and help build and help organise for those events to come, to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not made again, to ensure that revolution can spread, and to ensure that we can actually achieve a socialist society for all and the liberation of humanity. Thank you very much.